You know, have you ever really stopped to think about what an architect actually does all day? I mean, we see them in the movies, right? They're always sketching these incredible buildings on the back of a napkin, living this life of pure creative genius. But is that really the job? Well, we're going to pull back the curtain on the world of architecture and see what the reality looks like compared to that popular myth.
And this right here is the central conflict. On the one hand, you've got the dream, designing skyscrapers, literally shaping the skyline of a city. And then on the other hand, there's the reality, which is, well, a lot less glamorous. It's about the nitty-gritty details, right down to the toilets. So how do you get from the grand vision to, the plumbing? A huge part of our perception comes from pop culture. I mean, think about a character like Ted Mosby from How I Met Your Mother. That's what we're calling the Ted Mosby effect. It's created this really powerful, kind of romantic idea of the architect as this brilliant, visionary hero.
In this image we have in our heads, it's built on some very specific ideas. We see the architect as this visionary artist, just waiting for a lightning bolt of inspiration to sketch a masterpiece. They're the ones behind the whole skyline, living a life that just seems like one big creative project. It's a pretty amazing fantasy, isn't it?
Okay, so it's probably time for a little bit of a reality check, because the actual day-to-day grind of being an architect, it looks almost nothing like the movies. And the first piece of hard evidence against the fantasy is the clock.
Yeah, forget that image of a laid-back creative type. The reality is often 60-plus hours a week. That sheer amount of work is the first big crack in that polished pop culture image. It shows you just how demanding and high pressure this job really is.
And what are they doing for all those hours? Well, it's a lot less visionary sketching and a lot more of this stuff. Arguing with city officials over obscure building codes, getting buried in tedious paperwork, and meticulously, painstakingly drawing the plumbing and electrical layouts. You see, the job isn't always about the big picture. A lot of the time, it's about thousands of tiny, technical, and frankly, boring details. Which, of course, brings up a pretty big question, doesn't it? If most architects are down in the weeds with building codes and toilet layouts, who in the world is actually designing the amazing skyscrapers we all look up to? To understand that, let's use a really simple but powerful analogy that gets to the heart of how the architectural world is structured. Think about the difference between deciding to build a house and then actually laying every single brick by hand. The lead architect, this is the person building the house. They're the one doing that high-level visionary work we all think of, designing the whole system, the big idea, the dream. But here's the kicker. Only a tiny, tiny fraction of people in the profession ever actually get to operate at this level. For pretty much everyone else, the reality is laying the bricks. It's the detailed, technical, piece-by-piece work. And look, this stuff is absolutely essential. The house literally doesn't get built without it. But it's the unglamorous foundational work where the vast, vast majority of architects spend their entire careers. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about the status of the job itself. We've gone over the work, but what about the identity? And, maybe more importantly, what about the paycheck that comes with it? Because this is where that whole illusion really starts to fall apart. One source we looked at put it this way, and I just love this. Architects are glorified artists with math problems. It sounds kind of cynical, I know, but it's also so sharp. It just perfectly captures that weird conflict at the heart of the job. You're seen as this prestigious, artistic person, but you're constantly bogged down by the cold, hard rules of physics and finance. And speaking of finance, you have to see this comparison. The first bar here, that's the average salary for an architect. The second one, that's for a plumber. Now, the gap in perceived prestige between those two jobs is, enormous. But the salary gap, well, as you can see, it's surprisingly small. And this leads to a pretty humbling financial reality. After all those years of school, the insane hours, the immense responsibility, an architect can sometimes end up earning less than the very tradespeople they're in charge of on a job site. It's just a crazy contrast to the high-status image of the profession. So, after deconstructing the dream and looking at the grind, what's the real blueprint here? What's the main thing we should take away from all this? It really just boils down to this simple contrast. The myth is this idea of a lone genius, an artist having a sudden flash of brilliance. But the reality? It's a huge collaborative effort. It's a whole team of highly trained specialists who are meticulously, and often pretty thanklessly, laying every single one of those bricks to make that initial vision come to life. And that kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on. This whole deep dive was about architecture, but the pattern feels familiar, right?
It really makes you wonder, underneath the glamorous surface of any so-called dream job, is there always a reality that in its own way looks a lot like drafting toilets?